We're starting to realize that with audio, we're able to solve all these problems that I've identified that existed. And therefore, I can now find the right solution to it because I have built this. Auscultation was first used as a way of identifying the overall health of individuals, or at least our first evidence that we have of it, in ancient Egypt. The most kind of sort of cost-effective, time-effective, and immediate way of getting as good a picture as possible of someone's overall health is still auscultation. So the power of sound is just not going to go away.
Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Healthtech Podcast. Today with me, I'm delighted to have Roeland Decorte, and he's founder, CEO of Decorte Future Industries. They are using AI to extract health data from sound, and we're going to get into that in a second and get Roeland to explain all about it. Interestingly, has a PhD in ancient code breaking from the University of Cambridge, and expertise that spans mechanical engineering, prototyping, AI-driven health tech, manufacturing, and biometric sensing. What an interesting constellation of facts that is, Roeland. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the Healthtech Podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing quite well, thank you. How about you?
I'm okay. I'm doing all right. One of those weeks in startup and business land for me, but I'm sure you know what those are like. We ride the ups and downs, we ride the roller coaster, but as we talked about, it's probably going to be a bit of a tough year, isn't it? With markets where they are.
Exactly. It is going to be a bit of a tough year. You can see with a lot of startups kind of struggling right now. But then again, would it be fun if it wasn't hard? So,
Indeed.
That's the question.
Indeed.
If we aren't continuously challenged, we probably go and do something else.
Quite. Whereabouts are you speaking to from today, Roeland? Where are you based?
Cambridge. So just outside of Cambridge, really, a small market town or cathedral town called Ely. But yeah, so Cambridge is where I've been based for most of my adult life, and the company was started in Cambridge. Technically, we have offices in London, which is our VC's offices, but most of the team is also still based in Cambridge, and most of the people kind of come from the university as well.
Very nice. So listen, Roeland, so from Belgium to ancient code breaking to Cambridge to AI and sound technologies, this is a journey that I'm looking forward to getting into. So I'll get out of your way and let you begin. But yeah, by all means, Roeland, why don't you tell us a bit of that story?
Of course, yeah. I mean, it is a rather unusual journey, especially kind of as a tech entrepreneur. The PhD technically was in the humanities also. So I came to Cambridge quite young. I skipped a couple of years kind of at school. Ended up being attending some lectures at Cambridge when I was 15. Then got the full scholarship at 16, and then joined that at my 17th, kind of living there full time. Then at Cambridge, I essentially studied my undergraduate. I did my undergraduate, master's, PhD, ultimately in something called ancient code breaking. Now, ancient code breaking, that's essentially kind of using modern cryptographic methods, modern kind of mathematics, modern kind of linguistics on 5,000-year-old codes. So those are Minoan, Mycenaean kind of codes from kind of the Aegean. Really quite enjoyed that because it was one of those fields that very few people are looking at it. There hasn't really been much progress in about 100 years. So there's a lot kind of there's a lot of scholarship on it, but very little that kind of has been able to break through. So yes, I worked on that and published a couple of works that ultimately kind of ended up having a really good impact on the field. But the main reason why I ended up in health tech is something that actually happened to me before coming to Cambridge. So when I was about 11, my father was 39 years old. So my father was born with an atrial septal defect, so ASD, so a hole in the upper chambers of his heart. That's normally identified, diagnosed at birth, and normally kind of babies, when they're born, kind of they get checked for this. My father, either it wasn't identified for him at birth, or his parents were told and they never told him, but it wasn't addressed. He lived with it for the vast majority of his life until he was about 39, at which point sort of if you're familiar with ASD, the symptoms, especially if you have very severe ASD, the symptoms get worse and worse and worse until they eventually are no longer viable. So what happened is his heart essentially would cause him to have these kind of moments of extreme distress, especially kind of at night. He would wake up kind of not knowing what was happening. Went to the doctor. Doctor listened to his heart for maybe about 3-4 seconds. But at the time, he was the CEO of a retirement home, kind of, and then later kind of a chain of retirement homes. And what happened was they just said, it must just be stress. Just go home. It'll be fine. Then had that happen again a little bit later, sort of, still wasn't able to kind of sleep, had these kind of this clear feeling that something was wrong, went to a different doctor. They also listened to his heart for about five seconds, said everything's fine. So ultimately my mother who insisted, okay, no, we're going to do kind of a proper kind of look through, go and, in Belgium at the time, you could still go straight to the specialist. So obviously it's sort of private, so it costs a little bit more, but they did that. And then the specialist was like, you have this really serious kind of defect. You've had this since birth. It's been unaddressed since birth, and you need to have open heart surgery, and you need to have it essentially now.
Immediately,
and,
yes.
Yeah, and one of the things they said is, had you been in kind of maybe a month or so later, you wouldn't have made it. Like you'd be dead. So he did then have that open heart surgery. Ultimately, the survival chances in some ways were fairly high, but on a human level, quite low. If you kind of see these, if you see these numbers, and I remember one of the things that sort of stays with me, has always kind of stuck with me, and I've spoken about it in the past in like a couple of keynotes and stuff, is that he wrote this goodbye letter to my mother, my brother, and myself, because there was this good chance that he would make it, and this has an impact on you as a child, right? So he did that, but he survived. The only thing is that he ended up essentially disabled in the sense that he's now still struggling with kind of the downstream effects. He needs to spend a lot of time in bed. Has kind of the chronic fatigue as a result of it as well, and still has these kind of follow-up surgeries, etc., every couple of years. So his life dramatically changed. He had to quit his job, sell his company, and he hasn't worked since. So for me, my father was always home, often kind of in bed. It was this kind of thing that, as a child, young teenager, that's definitely something that you're very aware of. If your father's kind of always home, but also something that obviously has a very big impact on you kind of emotionally. So that was one thing that kind of always stuck with me. But one of the main things that stuck with me in that whole story is that I later discovered, and actually someone told me this, that had anyone listened to his heart for longer than about 30 seconds in the entire damn 39 years of his life, they would have picked us up, right? But they don't, right? No one really did. And the reason for that is our healthcare system, it's punctuated. You go kind of to the doctor, and they look at you, and they do it very swiftly and send you away. And it's instead of being horizontally broad, like they'll try and check for a lot of different things, is often kind of vertically very deep. So once you, like as happened with my father, once you think, okay, I have this specific issue, and you go to specialists, okay, then they will look at things kind of in detail. But otherwise, a lot of things can get missed. So that was kind of one of the things that I thought, well, surely it's easy to solve this problem, right? Surely in some ways, one always thinks that, right? That's how you start. If you didn't think an issue, it was easy.
The naivety that starts companies, yes.
Exactly. Naivety. That's 100% my belief, is that the vast majority of companies get started because of naivety, and that's exactly right.
Absolutely.
I mean, that has to happen, because that's how you. So I thought, surely this is super easy to fix. All we need to do is lots of sensors that you can get off the shelf. You can get an ECG, you can get like a temperature sensor, you can get an IMU, put it on the human body, connect it with Bluetooth Low Energy, kind of into the. So, and one of the reasons why I had been dabbling with tech my entire life, so I built computers, did kind of so all of that throughout my so I just now thought, I'm just going to start building this, right? How hard can it be? So basically, towards the end of my PhD, I started gathering all these sensors, built the sensor array, connected with BLE into the cloud, sent it into the cloud, built kind of the cloud infrastructure for it, and then very quickly realized why, no one else is doing this, and why it doesn't work, which is the only thing that we continuously wear on our human bodies is clothing, right? So I wanted to integrate it into clothing. So I thought, smart clothing that's continuously monitoring your health. That was the initial idea behind Decorte. And then very quickly realized, well, none of our clothing really fits us that well, which means that none of the sensors are actually tight enough against the skin, which means that it's not accurate enough for anyone to do any diagnostics on, or let alone, we don't even need to do diagnostics as long as we do pre-diagnostic triage, but it wasn't even accurate enough for that. So that was a challenge. So then, comes that, next to naivete, you have to kind of an over ambitious, I'm going to solve everything approach. I think that also needs to be one of the things that kind of starts companies. So at that point, I thought, well, if that's the issue, the problem of fit in clothing, I just need to solve the problem of fit as the first problem, and then I can get to the next one. So I started building, and it's over the course of about 2 years. At the time, I had no income. We struggled to pay rent. Everyone kind of, including my parents actually at the time, was like saying, "What the hell are you doing? Why are you giving up your academic career to start building these, which ultimately became exoskeletons in your, guest bedroom?" Yes, but I built these complex exoskeletons, and I built them with, lots of things I could scrounge because I had no funding or anything like that. So literally, there were tubes in there that like came out of, those free tubes you get for like the washing machine when you buy like a washing machine. So like, put like salt in there, like stuff like that.
Wow.
All these different things kind of combined into these exoskeletons. Ultimately, I built this thing where, if you step into it, it went zip. It automatically adapted to any human body shape or size. It had kind of this, initially it was kind of cloth, and it ended up being like a metal exospine, which had this kind of, it became quite complex. And ultimately sort of, there's a couple of steps there. And we can talk a little bit about that, like how, I got our first kind of angel supporter.
This honestly sounds like either the beginning or the end of your like superhero, like villain arc or hero arc. It's one of the two,
right? Either of the two. So there's a reason why I sort of stuck with the name Decorte Future Industries, which I created back then, because it's sort of a testament to, at the time, for about 3 years, it was a one-man company. It's sort of, it's kind of a sort of Batman universe.
It sounds like Batman, absolutely, exactly. And the branding as well. Like I get it.
Exactly. So I thought, we've had questions regarding it, but because of also quite the personal, because of the personal story, and actually investors quite like it when your name is on the business, because they know that you're not just gonna
skin in the
exit
game
quickly. And exactly. So started building these complex exoskeletons. Here comes the villain or the hero arc. Defense intelligence became aware that I was building these exoskeletons, and invited me to come and essentially benchmark it against other kind of exoskeletons and start doing kind of these things at a military basis. So I went to Warminster, went to kind of a couple of these bases, kind of showed our technology, kind of talked to people about this. Ultimately, ended up being the MOD. Ended up endorsing us, like the UK Army, specifically infantry trials and development, and it's again one-man company, no one else but me. And then DARSA wanted to bring in some significant funding, and so we had the letter of endorsement, which is basically what you then bring to DARSA. So DARSA, by the way, is a defense and security accelerator. It's like the UK version of DARPA. They invest in defense projects that they think might have a good impact on kind of national security, and that they then want government to directly invest into. Now, around that time, though, so what basically you do is you actually bring that endorsement letter to DARSA. DARSA then kind of gives you funding. I never did that. I decided not to essentially bring that. So I still have that letter. Technically, I'm not sure, if there's an expiration date on that, but it was around that time that I realized I haven't actually solved the problem I set out to solve, right? Because I started out with this problem that my father had, and now I ended up building spec ops military exoskeletons, right? And that was going to be, like a cool company. It's a company that, also could, be worth, a couple $100 million or whatever. It could be a company that kind of had an impact, but it wasn't the impact that I wanted to have. It wasn't in the field that I wanted it to be. And one of the, need to be a little bit careful saying this, but in some ways, government is the worst first client, right? In the sense that, extremely long kind of procurement timelines. Often they kind of fund things, but then it just sits on the shelf before it gets used. And by the time it then gets used, you as a company might be, that much further along in them. So it just to me didn't seem kind of the appropriate route forward. So at that time, I started thinking, okay, how do I basically end up with the same end result where I can continuously monitor human health, but do it a lot less invasively. So without having to have people kind of wear these complex exoskeletons. And then basically then the journey starts of you end up with this first very complex, really cool idea, but then you sort of dumb it down, if that kind of makes sense, or rather at least make it slimmer. And that's so much harder than building something complex. Building something simple is so much harder, right? And I mean, your listeners won't be able to see it, but there's this in-between version that I've got standing here in my office, which is the Mark 1.
Viewers on YouTube can see that, so very nice.
So the Mark 1 kind of was essentially kind of as a smart shirt, but that was around the time. So COVID hit, there was a lot of kind of research at the time was being done into being able to identify whether or not someone has COVID by just the sound of their cuffs. Right, and there was a research group at the University of Cambridge, research group in MIT. There was kind of there's people in like Australia kind of who were doing this, and that became quite big. And for me, what I sort of was thinking, well, actually, the main issue, as I've said kind of from the start, for us is skin contact. Sound is something that doesn't, that isn't as dependent on this. Like, for example, like an ECG, it is dependent on electrical signals. So it needs those electrodes that sit on the skin that need gel in order to, really kind of communicate with, basically give these accurate metrics. Sound is, you can be at a bit of a distance. Like it's not as precious. And the main thing that we also started discovering, and that's sort of I'll tell a little bit about how we got kind of our first employee then, and our current CTO Erica Bondariva, who's PhD at Cambridge specifically in audio-based machine learning, so to extract kind of complex health data such as cardiovascular data from sound, is sound is unique because it can do lots of different things. So whereas an ECG will only ever be able to do electrical activity related to the heart, right? Sound, where you can listen to your heart beating. You can also listen to the sound of your breathing. You can also listen to the sound that your gastrointestinal system makes as it's digesting things. And you can listen to the sound of your muscles moving. You can listen to the sound of, you speaking. All of these different kind of metrics all can identify and indicate individual kind of health, either pathologies or things downstream. Now, you talked a little bit earlier about, before the podcast, about how people kind of don't really explain how they met, like their first, so for example, I'll explain a little bit how Eric and I met, and also kind of how I got some of my first support, because obviously by this point, when you start bringing in people, again, why my journey is slightly unusual, by that time I already had funding. So I wanted to make sure that I had funding in place so I could start paying people from the start, so I didn't have to, just bring people along on the promise of equity, but instead kind of was able to already kind of start paying out salaries. And that was because, so my very first angel, even though that angel didn't invest, but he ultimately kind of ended up then leading me to others, because we still have a very close relationship, was Peter Cowley. So he's, I don't know if you've come across Peter. He was like Business Angel of the Year, president of the European Business Angel Network, etc. But he was selling his book, The Invested Investor, in Cambridge, kind of at a bunch of events, and everyone always wanted to go and talk to him, because he was like the main angel. I didn't have any, because one of these things, when you said you have naivete, right, at the beginning, like at the beginning was also for me like, okay, first of all, I thought, okay, surely it's easy to solve this problem. And the second thought I had, which I think a lot of entrepreneurs have, is as long as I build something really cool, people will come to me, right? That is completely not true, right? It is about the opposite. Like 90% of your entrepreneurial journey of building a company is you going out to people, right? Is you actually making sure that your tech is out there, is you validating your tech against. It's one of the reasons that we can go a little bit into that. I know you have this kind of top 10 or like these top tips for like CEOs kind of at the end, but one of the things that I always say is go and talk to as many people as possible, right? And the stealth startup, I have a very strong personal opinion that it often will hurt you rather than actually help you. So yes, so I at one point then realized, okay, I have to go out and talk to people. And the first time that I did that was I just, I realized that the CTO, current CTO, then head of engineering of Raspberry Pi, was graduating the Cambridge Executive MBA program. And I contacted him on LinkedIn saying, hey, showed up to his graduation, because being part of Cambridge, like I was part of the Senate, so kind of could be part of their graduation. Then contacted him on LinkedIn and said, hey, do you want to grab a coffee? I've built this like exoskeleton thing. And he's like, sure. And I showed up to like this coffee place, like the whole like put it on the table in front of him. And he was like, okay, this is cool. Yeah. Exactly. And he was like, this is cool. I'm on board. Like, what do you need? And that was kind of because at the time, my background was in code breaking, right? So what people didn't necessarily, if I went to, Angels or whatever, they didn't really have any, because especially in Cambridge, like every single person who starts a company has a PhD, or or has a team of PhDs in that specific field. Right? I started in a field where
it would make sense if you had a PhD in like biomaterials or something.
Exactly. But because my PhD was in code making, people like I couldn't even get in the door. That's why they often say you have to walk through walls. Well, that's sort of what I need to do. Like I needed to find people who were third parties who could say, actually, this tech is really cool. You should have a look at this. And like Gordon from Raspberry Pi was like he was the first person really after myself into the company as an advisor at the time. But then with Peter, he was kind of the main angel kind of in Cambridge with everyone, who's also chair at the time, I think, of the Cambridge Angels. And he, everyone wanted to talk to him. So I showed up to this event that was being organized by the Cambridge entrepreneurs. I ended up, pretending to be one of the organizers. So helped showed up early, helped set up chairs and whatever, so that I could be there when the speakers arrived. Then ended up in the speakers room, talked to him. I was like, okay, fantastic. Now I've got his card. But then what are you with that? He's still going to meet 30, 40 other people that evening. How are you going to stand out if you just got a little, just a business card? It doesn't really. But then I realized he was selling his book, The Investor. And I was thinking, okay, he's selling his book here in person. That's because, if you try and recommend to someone, hey, you really should read this book, they put it on a list with 100 other books on their smartphone and they'll get to it maybe at some point. However, if you're right in front of them saying, hey, you're an entrepreneur, you're starting a business, here's this book, the chances of them buying it, they go up, 100-fold. So I realized that why he was there was immediacy. So I ended up doing this thing where after the event, I called up all the main kind of bookstores in Cambridge, figured out whether or not they stocked his book. You had to order it online, which again took away that immediacy. So I kind of thought, well, a lot of authors, when you kind of are marketing your book, you'll have lots of books kind of at home as well, kind of sitting. And so I then kind of sent him an email saying, hey, so I know you're selling this book. I know kind of immediacy is the main kind of way of getting there. I'm going to all these entrepreneurial events anyway in Cambridge because I'm starting my company. How about I come by your place, pick up a lot of these books, sell them for you, and he was like, okay,
what an offer.
Here's 50% of the profits. And I said, I don't want 50% of the profits. I want your kind of mental, moral, support. And I just want to have a couple of chats with you and kind of, and he ended up being kind of someone that, gave me a lot of, imparted a lot of wisdom. And ultimately also he was one of the people that, so when I then applied for Techstars, he was one of the people that the Techstars people talked to as part of kind of the, and it was around the time then, when I was at Techstars and kind of, and obviously kind of Techstars, I could tremendously recommend to anyone. I think if you start a company and you're not applying to IC or Techstars, you have to have a really good reason not to, because I feel like it's really worth it. When kind of doing Techstars was then when I started kind of talking to Erica, my current kind of CTO, because one of these things that I, as I said, wanted to solve was how to actually bring continuous monitoring, or at least kind of this kind of broad, decentralized, out of hospital monitoring to individuals without having to build these, complex exoskeletons. And as time went on, essentially what happened, Erica was initially kind of hired to help work on the exoskeletons and the individual kind of sensors. So I think she started even in kind of temperature sensing. And then as time went on, however, we ended up replacing every single one of our standard biometric sensors with sound, because we started realizing that actually we can, using kind of the new machine learning that was just coming up, because this is a completely new field of machine learning. So automatic auscultation. It's sort of, I mean, when I say completely new, in the meantime, we've existed now for about, 4 years focused on this. So, in the last 4 years, this has become bigger and bigger and bigger, and you'll see kind of more and more companies in this space, more and more technology in this space. But we're kind of very much at the earliest stage of this. We started realizing that, as I said earlier, all these different metrics that get picked up by sound, using machine learning, we were able to actually get really interesting insights out of that. And in the end, we didn't need, the ECG anymore. We didn't need a lot of these kind of custom sensors anymore. We were able to do it with a single sensor, and that changes the game, right? If, for example, what we can do now, and we're 4 years long, so this took us a while to get here, but now you can hold your smartphone against your chest, and we can tell you, your heart rate variability, whether or not you have a murmur, etc., to the same level of accuracy as a full ECG system that needs a Holter with all those a wire sticking out of it. And when I say we, the same level of accuracy, this isn't just us having proven this in our kind of personal labs, kind of in but this is externally validated. So we are partnered with Apollo Hospitals, and we did live human testing, in front of a whole committee of doctors there to kind of demonstrate this. But that it changes the game, right? Because it means that everyone now has the actual technology in their pocket with which they can do this kind of health sensing, and that then goes from cardiovascular to respiratory to neurological to gastrointestinal.
Firstly, man, what a story! And I love the kind of radical honesty about how you've actually got here, and actually, it's not easy, is it? It's not easy getting in the room with the types of people that are going to endorse you for an accelerator. It's not easy building a tech company. You spoke about naivety. You spoke about just it's grind. 4 years later, and you're at this point. You're very honest. I do really appreciate that, and I think we can talk about this a little bit. So my first question is actually about code breaking, and it sort of strikes me that when you take the discipline of code breaking, not that I know anything about it other than what you would expect a layperson to know about it, is that what you're basically doing is taking a very noisy signal and trying to find meaning within it. That's not a million miles away from what you're doing with sound, right?
That is extremely insightful, James. And in fact, that so often I get the question like, how in God's name do you connect what you're currently doing with
Yeah, I actually think it's pretty
code breaking?
relevant.
Yeah. Well, and most people don't see the. I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. It's pattern recognition, right? It's getting rid of noise and recognizing patterns, and then seeing whether or not those patterns are meaningful. And in many ways, it's the exact same process. It's lots and lots of data, except for the specific code breaking that I sort of was involved in. So Mycenaean epigraphy, Minoan epigraphy, you have very little data, which makes it even harder, right? That's why there's been so difficult. But on average, in code breaking, you'll have lots of data. But primarily, it's looking at this data and then trying to find those patterns in it, like I say, getting rid of noise, also deciding what is noise and what isn't. And just in the same way that what we found with sound is that what people, and I know kind of people define noise differently, etc. So this is a bit of sort of an ephemeral point. But what people define as noise is everything that isn't relevant to what you're currently looking for, right? Noise doesn't have a concrete definition. But if you do something like what we're doing, where we're listening to, for example, if we then start listening to the sounds of the heart, the sounds of you breathing, the sound of your muscles moving, your stomach gurgling, is technically noise. But noise is super powerful here because that's exactly where, that's exactly the other, where we can expand into all of these other metrics. And if I think also about, for example, the big sort of the main thing that I published on in also ancient code breaking was the fact that for about 100 years, everyone had dismissed as noise lots of tiny little elements that stood around this. They were hieroglyphs. Lots of these different hieroglyphs, and then lots of little elements around there. And people essentially got rid of all those elements and then transcribed only the main characters in a way that they would understand how script works, like in a sequential kind of linear form. And then that got published in books like these. And then you would find in those books a very clean version of that script. But if you actually look at the original artifacts, you see there's all these little kind of elements on top, above, below it. There's like these bits of like art and all of these actually interact with the script and actually assign meaning to it. And without those, you actually can't understand. So no wonder there's not been any progress in like 100 years. And it's so in that way, actually, even the conclusion, not even like the place we start from, but even the conclusion is kind of similar between the two fields. Even if it sounds, very far afield, even if they sound very distant from each other, you're right that essentially it is the same process.
And there's something super interesting here, which is like as soon as I mention that, the amount of passion that you just explode with there is like palpable. And I think that is fascinating. The search for meaning is, of course, a source of passion for quite a lot of people, and quite a lot of things and quite a lot of places, right? And I think that's the sort of beauty that I see in this.
The sort of universality of it, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's the search for meaning in the micro, and we're all sort of in the search for meaning in the macro. But you've picked within sound. And what I do also get from that as well is that when you consider where we've sort of extrapolated this to in sort of training machine learning algorithms.
Yes.
I guess on the route there, or actually at the beginning when you're learning the discipline of code breaking, is that you're actually learning principles about code breaking that then do apply later to what you're talking about in taking these signals. So like the way that you appreciate noise and the meaning of noise, and the fact that can mean more than one thing. It means that it's going to be multifactorial, and you're going to look for multifactorial things and their interactions with each other and all that kind of stuff. And I guess, I wonder, I mean, I don't know if you know, like, what have those fellow code breakers gone on to do? Are there a lot of those that also think in mathematics and computer science? And I'm interested.
So less mathematics, more linguistics. So really interestingly, very interestingly. So the faculty that I was a part of, and then, for example, my Mycenaean epigraphy group in Cambridge specifically, so that works on this Minoan and Mycenaean kind of scripts, they themselves wouldn't even call it codes. They might not consider themselves, they might not go around. I mean,
Interesting.
there was a major sort of exhibition at the Fitzwilliam Museum where they call it code breakers, and they all kind of. But internally, it was seen actually as part of linguistics and as part of the classics faculty, right? Greek and Latin, and kind of so and it seems
it's a very different
again
brand,
so
classics
exactly
and linguistics to code
breaking
again.
Exactly, very different brand, right? But at the same time, if you then think that Mycenaean epigraphy group actually also has tremendous links and is one of the kind of places where originally you got individuals who ended up starting Bletchley Park. And that is because who at the earliest stages of code breaking, of computing, was used to dealing with these, complex sentence that they didn't necessarily understand the meaning behind, but were able to parse it because, there's certain grammar that is at the basis of all kind of, and then break it down into constituent parts and then be able to.
Indeed.
So, for example, Ventris and Chadwick, the people who deciphered linear B, which was, one of the codes that was broken. So Ventris, if I'm Chadwick, if I'm correct, so he was also in my group, my senior epigraphy group in Cambridge. I mean, he's sort of the founding father of it. He was also at Bletchley Park, if I'm correct. Like he was also one of the people and definitely a lot of those people ended up in that, in sort of the even though it starts at linguistics, it ended up in code breaking. Similarly, also the linguistics department there, kind of where Mycenaean epigraphy is part of. If you think actually about machine learning started primarily. I mean, a lot of, especially now, even LLMs, so it starts in NLP, natural language processing, natural language understanding, right? So there's this, again, the pattern of language then being, used and broken down. And so, yes, so there's definitely there's that link. And I think it's one of those, a lot of people really want to draw a very clear, stark line between kind of the humanities and the STEM kind of sciences. What people who are slightly further along often in their career kind of realize. Yes. It's a bit like, when you're also like an undergraduate, you think, oh, I know everything about my field. And when you're an MPhil, you kind of realize, oh, I know a bit about my field. And as a PhD, you realize I know one thing and I know nothing about anything else. That's sort of how that story goes. Well, similarly, also, I feel as you go on kind of in your journey of kind of exploring all these different disciplines, is that you actually realize that line is very, very soft. Because if you think about what is, most machine learning, indeed, like whether it started like a lot of this kind of NLP, etc., you can't do that without having non-linguistics. So even my wife, for example, her background is linguistics. She then worked for Google designing the Google Assistant. So there's a lot of overlap there that I think it might not be immediately clear to a lot of people.
Yes, really, really interesting. God, there's so much that I want to talk about here. The next, well, I'll pull out one more sort of entrepreneurship lesson before I move on to talking about sound. But the other one I think we can talk about is focus, because you talked about the winding road that took you from wanting to what did you want to do? You wanted to basically take the fact that your father didn't get the person listening for long enough or well enough or accurate enough, and then designing a solution for it. That took you on a route towards sensors. It took you to smart clothing. It took you to exoskeletons, until you kind of have this existential moment of who am I? What am I doing? This is too far from my purpose, when you're in front of MOD and talking about the applications that I imagine are quite wild of this sort of thing. And then that recognition of, following something. You were following, I guess, in part your interest, but also we're all quite, it's much easier to walk through an open door than it is to bang down a brick wall. And I think, when you're getting these doors open for you towards, defense and these things that will show commercial viability and allow you to make impact in some way, I can sympathize massively, and I can empathize massively, in fact, that you can get taken down these routes, and only once you get a certain length down that route do you realize, like, hold on a minute, I do need to change, otherwise known as a pivot, right? And
exactly,
you did this quite wonderfully, and I like, you're not beating yourself up for that. It's part of your journey. This isn't 100%. Linear, this route. You do have to turn around and go back and take different paths, right? So I don't know, what's your relationship with focus?
Yeah, so and that's something that, to me, like, and when I give talks, I tend to actually do it about that specific kind of
Interesting.
topic, like pivoting and the power of pivoting and why, and that's sort of because that's what I learned from my story. And like you say, when walking through walls, because that's sort of what I, when I said, defense got interested, obviously there was also ways because I started putting myself out there. I ended up kind of at defense conferences, kind of these. When walking through walls, you still will end up, by definition, walking through the thinner ones, right, rather than the very thick ones. So, like you say, even I wouldn't quite have considered them open doors because I had to bang my head against the wall to get anywhere for anything. But
those are the ones that gave way first.
Exactly, but those are the ones that sort of gave way first. And I think, and again, this I'm sort of preempting my at the end kind of top tip for tips for kind of CEOs. But one of the things that I always say is, and it's such a cliche, but genuinely some cliches, some kind of bromides, they really hold. And this is one that I feel really holds, which is fall in love with the problem, not the solution. Right. So for me, throughout this whole thing, the problem I was trying to solve remained exactly the same. Right. It was basically connecting the human body into the internet of, basically creating the internet of bodies, connecting the human body into the digital world by having continuously our metrics streamed into the cloud, or at least kind of, if not continuously, then at least, having an easy way of sending health data directly from the human body into the cloud. That remained constant, but then the way in which I went about it, tried to find these different solutions, that changed. And then you had to kind of, and what I always say is, for people who don't, so if you're a company that has never pivoted, that makes me, so I also do a bit of DD for like some VCs. At this point, I'm also on a bunch of advisory boards. I also run IFA, the Motors Artificial Intelligence Founders Association. So I see lots of startups kind of come and pass review. And one of the things that I always feel is, if people say with sort of pride, we haven't pivoted, or, if you have a company that's never pivoted through their entire history, it's one of two things, right? Either they had the right idea at the right time, in the right execution, deployed to the right market, focused on the right market, with the right team, or they're kidding themselves. Like they're not actually listening to the data that's coming back, right? In reality, the entrepreneurial journey, starting a company, is continuously listening to market feedback, third-party feedback, industry feedback, and continuously adapting yourself and continuously finding out what is the best solution to this problem. And one of the things we see in health tech, especially a lot, is extremely clever, intelligent people, often people who come from the industry, who solve a problem really, really well, who have this kind of really cool technology, and then end up not finding a market for it, and technology dies. And then afterwards they ask, how could this die, considering that I know as a person, because I had this problem, that there is this need for it, but it just didn't get deployed with the end users. How, I don't understand what was that. And that is exactly kind of why it is a squiggly journey. Because if you do want to get up to the end users, you need to figure out not just build cool technology, but build technology in a way, in a form, brought to a market in a form that ultimately will actually end up benefiting the end users. And that will always be I admit mine definitely has been a particularly kind of windy journey, but it will always be kind of in some ways kind of a windy journey. So I think in that sense, I would always consider a pivot the sign of, I mean, obviously you can have very strange, but I've even seen very strange pivots work. So I'm gonna tell a story of a friend of mine. This is a real story, and it's not, I won't name the company necessarily, even though they're now also exiting. But they started out, so they were PhD machine learning at Cambridge. So when I was, obviously, part of me starting a company that was a tech company, then ultimately also ended up in ML, meant that I ended up spending lots of my time, even though technically I was part of this linguistics kind of group. I most of my time spent in the engineering faculty, or the machine, the computer sciences, etc. So I met all these individuals, became close friends with a lot of them. So and one. Graduated PhD AI at Cambridge, decided, okay, the UK scene, it's a lot harder to raise funding here. Jumped on a plane to the Silicon Valley after his PhD, slept on like a floor there of a friend's house, ended up starting a company, started that company. That company did, well, now a bunch of companies do, but at the time they were unique, was they essentially, when you speak, they continuously transcribe what you're saying, then make an automatic, and this was about 4 or 5 years ago now. They make it an automatic summary of it. That summary, will then can then be kind of analyzed, etc. And then you can search so basically like a second brain, you can then search anything you've said to like make sure that, and in any conversation, so for example, your or my conversation, if I want to go back and it's like a perfect memory plus kind of automatic kind of summaries. And again, there's a couple of companies doing that now. But at the time, the machine learning wasn't really there yet to make summaries that were, the same type of summaries as a human would make, because it was still at the time kind of AI was quite, because obviously we made huge strides in the last 4 or 5 years at the time to try and figure out what was actually important to any one individual in that conversation was a problem that, because it's a subjective problem that at the time, especially before the large scale foundation models that we see now, was something that wasn't easily solved. So they ended up pivoting initially to specifically do the due diligence, like auto transcription of due diligence conversations with VCs, because that's what they knew best at that point, because they had been raising from VCs. But then after that, they pivoted to a VR startup. And they are doing office space in VR. And then after the office space in VR, they ended up being, because they built these basically out days for companies in VR, right?
Yeah.
And then because they had lots of people playing their games, they ended up actually building VR games. And then they ended up being a VR game studio, and now they recently sold. They recently kind of and that was okay, that isn't necessarily falling in love with the solution, but they realized at that point that they weren't at a stage where their solution was going to work. I mean, had they stuck with it, potentially they could have now used the advances in AI to achieve their original goal. But even that is a type of pivot that ultimately ended up in their favor. But that's different from obviously what we have done at DFI, and I do personally think that a pivot can be a show of strength rather than weakness. I've always
and bravery and lots of different things, because I think as humans and as people that are the founders of these companies and work in these companies, like I think particularly founders, you have to battle identity as well there, because you can base your identity around a certain problem, almost like we have in the framing of this podcast, right? We frame this in terms of like a personal story about your father and wanting to make impact in that way, and if you end up pivoting towards defense and all the rest of it, we do battle with the identity and what that means for us. But for those that
definitely
are brave, and for those that want to, and for those that can, and for all those different reasons that they want to achieve the impact in that way, then of course, why not? And from a business and a commercial standpoint, where we take and strip emotion back from it, and we look at companies starting for the benefit of shareholders, you're like, well,
I know.
In part, we probably should be doing this.
Exactly. Yeah.
But we're emotional beings, Roeland.
Exactly. We are emotional beings. And so one of the things that I often get asked is, how hard was it? Because in some ways, when I eliminated the exoskeletons, it was sort of because that's what I had worked on, if you remember those 2 years, literally living on like water, because, and my wife being the only person in the whole world who believed in me, like it was like sticking with me, whereas everyone, including my parents, were like, like this, you are absolutely insane. We have no idea what you're doing. Everyone same at the academic world, they were all like, this guy's just gone loopy. But what ultimately kind of then happened is I had to get rid of that, right? I got rid of basically took, if your startup is your baby, I took my baby behind the shed, and there's a question I often get asked is, how hard was that? That must have been a really hard thing to do. Well, my answer to that is, it's one of the easiest decisions I ever made. Was it painful? Sure. But it's one of the easiest decisions I ever made, because at that point, I saw there is a better solution here. We're starting to realize that with audio, we're able to, and with machine learning using kind of audio, we're able to solve all these problems that I've identified that existed. Like this was perfect to identify the sets of problems that existed and trying to solve the core problem they're trying to solve. And therefore, I can now find the right solution to it because I have built this. Like it was a tool to get there, but in the end, it wasn't a hard decision. It wasn't a hard decision at all. And I think, the one thing that is hard is I ended, and I think this is true for a lot of founders who built the initial technology that starts the company and then move on, is as time goes on, you have to cede more and more control over actually building, large parts of technology too, because your team starts growing, and if you're used, especially like I was, for multiple years to do the whole end to end, everything from because the exoskeletons had AI controls in it to like the original mechanical design that we patented of like the exoskeleton, and then you end up basically in a space where you have lots of machine learning engineers, even the individual machine learning engineers not knowing what not necessarily had the knowledge exactly how the system that the other one builds works, versus then also when I'm on leading the company, kind of having to be less and less involved in the actual engineering of it. That was hard for me, because I constantly want to say, okay, I want to get to the brass tacks. I want to get down to, exactly, the nitty gritty of it. But at one point you can't anymore. And ceding that control, that was much harder than giving up, but was ceding the sort of, basically saying, okay, for efficiency's sake, like it doesn't make sense that I try to now, if I have this team of PhDs in machine learning, that I try to be the one now, to write the code. It will be a lot less efficient.
Ceding control, and that's a whole nother podcast and leadership and all the rest of it. I want to talk about sound, and I want to talk about mention initially that in my experience as a ground floor clinician, and even since as being involved in technology and all the rest of it, I have learned that there is a relationship in medicine between the discipline and sound that I think is so strong, and I think there's an argument that it will never be broken. The stethoscope was invented, I believe, in 1816. And the stethoscope still hangs around the necks of doctors. It is still the go-to of doctors and some other clinicians too, physios, nurses, as a means of getting the information that they need. There is a relationship there that in 200 years plus has not been broken and still remains almost exactly the same as the first day that the stethoscope was used. And I think I've written articles on point of care ultrasound, and is the new wave of point of care ultrasound going to change? Is it going to eradicate the stethoscope? Are we going to walk around with ultrasounds around our neck to get a better view? I just don't see it. I just don't see the world where we're ever going to change that, which is a bizarre thing to say, in all honesty, because I think it's so rare that someone looks at a 200-year-old technology and doesn't try to change it. I think it has tried to be changed in some ways. And I actually point to other things like speculums and like these other devices that, like, will someone please just like modernize this stuff? And people are, because, I know some of these companies. And I think it's actually a relatively easy thing to do in medicine sometimes, is just look at what hasn't changed in 100 years and just go and change it. And probably there'll be a market for it. Make it slightly cheaper and better and quicker and all the rest of it. And actually please make it better for the patient, number one, but like a few of these other benefits, and all of a sudden you're probably going to get it bought. That's probably not a bad place to start for anyone that's just done engineering that wants to just look at take that sort of view on medicine. But I think it's a really interesting place to start, because when you were telling your story initially, I was kind of thinking to myself, like, where does this fit in, and where does this fit into the world that we want in the future, and where we want healthcare to be in the future? And I think the answer is that sound is going nowhere. I really don't think it is. And when you combine the convenience of auscultation, it's got a name in medicine. That's how closely the relationship exists.
Through sound. Exactly.
You've got auscultation and you've got smartphones, which everybody has. Now, all of a sudden, you've got a device with enough power to send a man to the moon, with a sort of a version of the stethoscope which has been around for 200 years. So it makes sense that we kind of amplify the power of the stethoscope in something that you're talking about, and then move it closer to the community, which is then at home. So that's my hypothesis and kind of where I'm coming at this from. So what's your view on this? Like, where do you see this being used? Where do you think healthcare goes? Because in part, as founders of tech companies, you guys have to take a world that we live in next. You have to take a view on where we're moving to. Right? You have to think like where. Well, exactly, right? It's in the name. It's in the name of your company. So I'm interested in how you feel about all of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, all super interesting points. As to the sort of, I'll start at the end, go back to the beginning, and then get to the middle. But as to sort of sound not going anywhere, kind of remaining fundamental to so many things that we do and will do, kind of in medicine. I am 100% convinced, and I often say this, in fundraising calls. This isn't a spiel. It's the truth. That is my personal conviction. If not us, someone else will do this. This will happen regardless. Like we're trying to execute in the best way possible so that we become the main engine that drives this revolution, right? But if not us, someone else will do this, because the barriers are so low. Everyone has a microphone in their pocket right now, and a microphone it costs 0.30 pounds at this point. It costs about 30 cents. Like it's not 30 pence. It's not it's extremely, so the infrastructure is there. It's just that the technology, like the machine learning, has only recently arrived at a place where the two can combine into this very powerful. Now, as to your original point, which is 200 years of kind of almost no change with the stethoscope, auscultation was first used as a way of identifying the overall health of individuals, or at least our first evidence that we have of it in ancient Egypt, right? Thousands and thousands of years of history with auscultation, right? And like you say, in many ways, that's kind of insane when you think about it. But from then to now, basically putting your ear, which is what a stethoscope does in an enhanced way, against the human body and listening remains the best way to do a broad horizontal kind of analysis of that human's health,
of
right?
overall health. Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So and otherwise, if it then obviously these days with modern machinery, you can go vertically deep in lots of different kind of elements. And yes, you could do kind of even a full body scan, but the most effective and the most kind of sort of cost effective, time effective, and immediate way of getting as good a picture as possible of someone's overall health is still auscultation. It has been, like I say, for thousands of years. And nevertheless, part of that story that I told of my father, where I kind of said at the end, it shows how our current healthcare system is punctuated, rather continuous, but also how it's become vertically deep rather than horizontally broad. What I sort of meant with that is that I think you might appreciate, some of your listeners might, the general public might be less aware of this, but auscultation is also sort of also a dying discipline. Like fewer and fewer kind of individuals are really well trained in kind of using the stethoscope because
it's just the step before the test. It's just the step before the radiology. It's just the step that enables the next bit. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. And what happens is, even at the very earliest stages of our type of machine learning, and even the type of machine learning that others have done in our field, the machine learning was able to outperform junior doctors with auscultation, because auscultation is actually quite a tough, it's something that requires, quite a lot of training. It's in some ways fairly tough, and it is kind of a dying discipline. And that's also because so many, we now have machines to do everything very in depth. But the thing about that is you have to be in a centralized place, which is your healthcare center, which is your hospital, which is your, clinic. Yes. And how does that tie to what I said earlier about kind of futurism, kind of future of healthcare? If not us, someone else is going to do this. We are going to a world, and this is, has to happen because of also the so many healthcare systems being overloaded now. We are going to a world where healthcare will become more and more decentralized. With then, when it's necessary, you get into these, centers. But before that, the type of screening, the triage, the making things efficient is by having lots of things happening outside of the hospital as well, right? And that's sort of where I believe we come in. So the power of sound, like you say, it's something that is just not going to go away, and it's sort of now unlocked by machine learning. It's a bit like with a lot of these kind of, the sudden big change that happened with LLMs, etc. Kind of there's a stage now where for the first time digital signal processing and kind of machine learning has become so strong that we can take away the noise, as you said, even though, as I said earlier, noise is powerful, and we can focus on these individual elements, and then we can have the system learn what is normal, what is not normal, and then make conclusions on the basis of that. And that doesn't have to be diagnostic at this stage. It can be pre-diagnostic, right? It's going to be the decision whether or not the system says, okay, it might be useful to go and see, and we can get a bit more into that when we go to kind of the GTM strategies, go-to-market strategies specifically for our company, for example. But yes, so the way I often say, the best, easiest way to explain what we do to third parties is often I say, imagine a superhuman doctor who can hear more than the human ear can ever hear, constantly attached to your body, holding a stethoscope against your chest and like following you everywhere, right? Or every time you hold your smartphone, essentially that against your chest, that kind of thing happening. And that's sort of that's what we do, and that's not ever gonna go anywhere, because I already think we have done the very vertically deep, and we might get better and better machines to identify individual pathologies. But I feel with this kind of triage things, we will have better and better algorithms that can identify individual kind of early kind of detection, etc. But we're basically at the start of that. And then if you want to think about kind of the futurism, I don't know if you've ever played like the game Cyberpunk or like thought about these kind of So in the future, like it's in some ways, if you think about video games, right? We would never play a video game where we don't have a health bar for the main, or at least very few games don't have a health bar with the main character with some status effects, right? But nevertheless, we're all happy because that's how we keep track of how are we doing. Do we need to intervene? Do we not need to intervene? Do I need to use a health pack or whatever? In the real world, we're all going through life kind of blind. We don't have the status effect. We could have a serious illness right now that, again, like with my father, had anyone listened to him for 30 seconds at any point, could be diagnosed, but they just don't because no one's looking at it, and that's kind of insane. So I think when in a quantified world, right, which is what's happening now, health is the next thing to become continuously quantified, and I firmly believe in that, and I think that's the type of future that we're helping to build towards.
Interesting for those that want it, and that's a philosophical point. But
for those that want it, yeah, and also there's lots of privacy, there's lots of kind of things to address there as well, which is why the technology that we're building also is something that you have to physically hold against your chest for it to work.
Yeah,
there's some crazy things that you can do though, where it's just voice based and you put it in the middle of the table. It can get crazy. Yeah.
Where does it fit into healthcare? So who buys it? So who pays for it? Who uses it? And what is the clinical flow of when something goes wrong? How do you perceive it fitting into healthcare?
Yep. So there's a couple of ways, and this is where kind of when we also said there's so many fantastic inventions within the health tech scene that then end up, individual doctors definitely want to use them, but because of the way in which the go-to-market has been set, kind of it never ends up kind of being used in the long term, even though it passed all the tests with flying colors, etc. So in health tech, more than almost, more than most industries, definitely more than like B2B SaaS software that everyone is, for optimizing like admin or whatever. But when trying to change something as fundamental as the way in which we diagnose people, the way in which kind of triage people, etc., you have to be very careful in setting your GTM. So there's a for us. So we have partnerships. So we're partnered with Apollo Hospitals, which is the largest private healthcare provider in India, one of the largest in Asia, something like 73 hospitals, 200 million patients. We're partnered with cardiovascular clinics in the US, where we're doing kind of clinical studies. So in India also, we're doing clinical studies where we gather actually the world's largest data sets of audio to kind of health data. So 42 million individual data points. And we're also partnered. So what we've also done is we've done actually tests on canines, so pet dogs who have known cardiovascular problems, who are brought into veterinary clinics, specialist clinics, and we also kind of. But basically, for us, one of the things that we quickly realized is, for example, the cardiovascular clinics in Delaware, they specifically said, "Oh, we really want this technology. We want to deploy it. We want to kind of use it right now because it optimizes kind of the way in which." So, say for example, for heart failure, right at the moment, if you're in a certain stage of heart failure, what is actually happening is you get sent home and then you're supposed to weigh yourself, right? And you need, and that is about as high tech as it and you weigh yourself to exactly fluid accumulation, etc. But if through our technology, by listening to, we can actually they can just hold their phone against the chest, and we can kind of see that
finer than the human ear can hear. All of a sudden, you've got earlier diagnosis. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. So that basically what they're saying is, okay, just being able to already, for example, or even certain conditions like we can do murmur detection with almost something like 93% kind of accuracy. We're doing in India for the clinical trials, is atrial fibrillation detection, things like that. Also, early kind of identification of that leads to essentially preventing it from escalating. Means that down the line you save hospitalization costs, right? So both the individual and kind of especially kind of also clinics, they want to optimize their processes. Most of the people that the Delaware clinics see are actually people who say, "Oh, I feel I have a problem with my heart," but end up not having any kind of complex pathologies. If they had a way to kind of screen beforehand, they optimize their processes. So there's lots of ways why they want to use it, but there's a lot of ways also why I feel that that's not the best market for us to immediately deploy it. So whilst we're doing that with them, whilst we're working with them, and they basically are they are at this moment, they've decided they're willing to pay for our technology to use it in their specialist clinics. After a while, what then needs to happen is then lots of different clinics need to start using it, need to see kind of the advantages to it. Then ultimately you get into kind of this the reimbursement, which is when payers such as, and so we mainly focus in the US, then Medicare, Medicaid, etc., start paying for this because it leads to better patient outcomes and it helps our clinics optimize. But that is a very long-term journey. That, for example, most venture capital will not be seeing kind of the returns that they want in the time that they want. So that's what most people would do, and it's also what we've explored and what we've engaged with, and that is there. So that's going on in the background, but that is not where I see the primary kind of impact of our technology. Because as I also said to you, the way in which I see the future of our technology is not necessarily once again you go to a centralized place and then you get prescribed, so to speak, our app. It's more that outside in a decentralized way, it's something that has an impact of all of us that all of us can kind of continuously use. So there's a couple of ways. So down the line, that can be kind of through the release of the general engine. But at the moment, we have a very clear go-to-market, and it is via insurance. So insurance companies have a massive vested interest in decreasing hospitalization rates. So, for example, because obviously it decreases the cost that the amount of money that they have to pay out for every one of their individual kind of policyholders. So what essentially happens is we had the clinics that deploy our technology that work with us calculate how much on average gets saved if our technology is used, say, once a week by a person holding their phone against their chest and identifying whether or not kind of they have a pathology. It's between 16 to 31K per patient that an insurer kind of downstream saves by preventing kind of hospitalization through early detection. And so for insurers, as part of their policies, it's kind of a no-brainer. I mean, at the moment they go to do things like, for example, the CTO, ex-CTO of Disney, ex-CTO of IKEA as well is on our board. And one of the things they used to do in Disney is they used to have, like, every Thursday, I think, was farmers market. And the only reason for that was that they wanted to try, Disney was a self-insured company, and they just need to try and get their employees eating more greens, because that's the impact that has on the on the actual
Absolutely.
downstream health, and then the amount of money that they pay out in insurance policies, right? It's tremendous. So something like this, where you can actually pre-triage for a whole set of different pathologies, you can let people know when they're developing or when kind of they are at risk of developing kind of these pathologies early. For insurers, that's kind of extremely, and the advantage there, and this is something that kind of we mentioned, I think, either before we jumped on onto the actual podcast proper, but it's the regulatory scene, right? Obviously, everything that we're doing in India, in the US, in Belgium, so in specifically this cardiovascular clinics, kind of veterinary clinics, is heavily regulated. It obviously also we work with the regulators in order to kind of get approval for the individual studies. There's ethics approvals, there's all of this, and that's all really good. That shows us that we are externally validating that our technology works in a way that is as effective and as kind of clear cut as it can be, and we create this kind of general trust in the fact that our technology works. With insurers, however, we are not giving people diagnosis. We're not saying hold your phone against your chest and yes, we detect that you have atrial fibrillation, we detect that you have a murmur. We can do that, but we don't have to for that. What we can just say is we would recommend, basically a bit like when you fill in a form as when you with some of these kind of insurance policies, you're required to fill in like a monthly form, like regarding your health, like it's basically a bit like that, to say, okay, we have this, you hold your phone against your chest, and then we identify, okay, we recommend that you go and see, or rather your insurance has kind of arranged for you to go and see a cardiovascular kind of, clinic to have a look at, and then the clinic will diagnose whether or not it's a murmur. We don't have to do that, as long as we do kind of the triage, and that means that we actually can now work in a space where we're not subject to the immediately subject to the regulation, where because there's this huge difference between being able to say we think you, or rather, versus this is diagnosed.
Class 1 and class 2, yeah, indeed.
Exactly, because once you actually say, you are diagnosed with this disease, if you don't get it wrong, you kind of, it's obviously kind of a legal thing, and that's where a lot of medtech has fallen in the cracks, between the cracks, right? Because it's hard to get from one end to the other, and especially also, as we said, kind of with venture capital, they won't want to wait for like reimbursement. They want to see the impact you can have on the world right now, and this is for us kind of a way of showing that. And in the end, it helps. It's one of those few places in in proper market driven kind of philosophies where everyone looks out for themselves. So it's one of those few places where everyone's interests are aligned, because the individual wants to be as healthy as possible, and the insurer wants the individual to be as healthy as possible, right? So it's actually quite and then we give information that helps both of them achieve that. So it's actually one of the places where we ethically kind of also feel really quite good about it. Yeah.
So Roland, listen, fascinating stuff. I think, as I alluded to before, I think the relationship between sound and medicine is a fascinating one. I always look at the technologies with like an adoption lens, because I've worked on the ground floor, and I always kind of think to myself, like, could I see myself using it, particularly for those things that are aimed at clinical decision support or all that type of thing. Like I just sort of feel like I've not been out that long in the grand scheme of things, although it's getting longer and it's getting less relevant, my knowledge, but I know enough people to ask these questions to if needed. But can I see myself using it? I think where sound is related and where you're sort of augmenting what is already going on with a stethoscope, you're adding a layer of accuracy, you're adding a layer of actually defensibility as well for some of those clinicians. So it's the friend of the clinician, it's the friend of the patient, it's the friend of the insurance company, and it's taking something we already do and, as I say, augmenting it, making it more accurate,
which is what AI really does. A lot of people are worried about AI replacing, but actually what AI does best is augmenting. Yeah.
And it has to, and and that's the thing. And you talk about its performance versus junior doctors, and I think it's like in that one domain, in that one very narrow domain, it will outperform. It does not outperform in the empathy and understanding of conducting the consultation. And so
exactly, one of the things we always say is the aim is never to replace a doctor. If that is your aim at this stage now, like we're far too early for that, and even down the line, you will want a human in the loop on these systems. So
absolutely, all the time, and it's going to be a situation where it's not just one AI, is it? It's going to be so many different AIs that are augmenting so many different things that a doctor does, and that, I guess, is where perhaps the vision of healthcare in the future is moving to. This idea that yes, the human, the clinician or the clinicians, that team is still operating as a team around that person. They're deploying the empathy that only they can as human to human, the communication, that feeling of understanding that's never going to be replaced. But indeed, behind the scenes, in terms of the accuracy of diagnosis, the accuracy of the treatment, the accuracy of all those things, and will be augmented by multiple AIs that are working in lots of different ways, probably together. And I think it's a really interesting way to, I think, envision healthcare in the future. And as I say, sound is just so crucial to that. I still think.
Yeah, I think thinking about AI as tools, right? And if you like, you will always need to have someone who decides what tools to use, if that kind of makes sense. And the tools can be extremely, but you will always need someone to so that's, and like you say, I think sound is indeed going to be crucial to it. I mean, it has, as we discussed, for the last thousands of years been sort of often the point of entry. And I think it will remain the point of entry, so to speak, for the next 1,000. Yeah.
Indeed, and if people in hospitals start walking around with point of care ultrasounds around their neck connected to their smartphones for a quick ultrasound here or an echo there, I think fine, that may be a direction of travel inside a healthcare organization or a healthcare site. It's not going to be the case out in the community for a very, very long time, if at all. So there's always going to be a place for this. So listen, man, as I say, absolute pleasure having you on. I've honestly really enjoyed this. I think the link between code breaking and machine learning and what you do, I think, is fascinating. Yeah. I'd love to see what all the other code breakers are doing. Not that they might want to brand themselves as that. But listen, man, absolute pleasure. So for those people that want to learn more about what you're up to, and indeed, I believe you're raising. So for the investors listening, if they are interested in learning a bit more about you and the company, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
Just go to our website, so www.decorte.co.uk, and then directly my email's on there. So reach out.